If you enjoyed my recent interview with Dr. Nathan Bryan and the health effects of nitric oxide and are curious to work with this very interesting molecule, as listeners of the show, you receive 10% off all orders from their website using the code UNIVERSE at checkout. I really enjoyed my conversation with Dr. Bryan and his holistic approach to health, which really emphasizes not adding on or doing more things, but first focusing on the unhealthy habits that limit our own endogenous production of nitric oxide. So focusing on that first and then working to add some supplementation. I think he's doing really good work and is very much in alignment with my own philosophy. So check them out, and I will put a link to their website and the discount code UNIVERSE in the show notes. On this episode of the podcast, I sat down with my friend Marta Wanderlust. This is Marta's second time in the podcast. The previous time was about 5 years ago, and since then she has had the birth of 2 children, and that was really the primary focus of this second interview. It was a very beautiful interview, I think, touching on a lot of really interesting subjects on childbirth, on the ceremonial aspect of that, very much how it's related to plant medicine work, the initiatory rites. She had a very difficult birth of her first child, which, as she said, really was a dark night of the soul for her and really led her to begin a process of self-inquiry and really trying to find the root of some of the mental, emotional belief patterns behind that, which really led to what she describes as a very beautiful and profound second birth. We also spoke about ideas of the sovereignty of childbirth, the sovereignty of women with her second birth, doing that basically on her own outside of the medical system. We also spoke about that idea of the medicalization of the birthing process and some of the downsides of that. Just this idea of in a collective sense, the faith, the power that we put into institutions, and as she speaks about the unweaving of some of this, was a really beautiful interview. We also talked about faith and spirituality, also her journey with Christ. So it was very beautiful, and I was really impressed with what she shared and how she shared it, really from a depth of a very, I think, profound lived experience. So I trust you all will get a lot out of this episode. As always, if you're able to support this podcast, Patreon is a really good way. It's a website. You can sign up for as little as $1 a month. I really like the idea behind that website because it's built off this idea of reciprocity. So if you feel like you're gaining something from this podcast, that's an amazing way to give back. As always, thank you very much to all of the patrons supporting that way. And then also, if you're interested in working with myself and my colleague Marav Artsy, we have our 2026 calendar up now. We'll be working in Europe and Ireland and Peru and the Sacred Valley. We'll be doing some remote dietas. Beautiful opportunity to go deep and into this plant medicine work, this world of plants and trees. So if you'd like more information about that, you can check out my website at nicotianarustica.org, and there'll be a link to that in the show notes. So I think that's it for the introduction, and without further ado, here's my conversation with Marta.
Running out from the maze, running out from the maze, running out of the maze today. Running out from the maze, running out from the maze, running out from the maze today. I'm running out from the maze, running out from the maze, run out of the maze today.
Well, very good. Well, thank you, Marta. We were already chatting before we started, and I think there's a whole world of things we could talk about. So we'll try and focus the conversation and see what comes up. But this is your second time on the podcast, and I think you're maybe only the second, maybe third person who I've had back on. So congratulations to you for that. And I think if people are interested to learn more about you, the last time I think we spoke a lot about your work, your teaching, the book even that you released, so people can go back and listen to that.
But if they don't do that, just as a standalone episode, maybe you can still just speak a little bit about yourself, about who you are, your journey, and kind of what you've done in your life that's brought you to the point you are right now.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for the honor of being the third guest to have come back. I was remembering that last time we spoke, it was like 5 years ago, 5.5 years ago, something big. And I was at the threshold of potentially already being pregnant or just about to get pregnant with my first child. So a momentous 5 years in between then and now in terms of who I have unbecome and the eternal ego deaths that parenthood seems to bring into our field, and then this rebirth and rediscovery of who I am to be as also a mother. So I am a space holder, I am an author, published author, and I am a mother, and I find that over these last 5 years of birthing two children, my sense of who am I in the world and what I am here to share has been eternally morphing. Prior to having my children, my work was very much oriented around psychospiritual exploration, plant medicine, trauma integration, somatic and embodiment-oriented practices, all really curated for people to have this experience, very embodied experience of reclaiming their sovereignty and reconnecting with God, source, spirit, totality, however they name it. And what I found on the back of becoming a mother is that motherhood, parenthood has truly been the ceremony. None of my previous plant medicine work and spirit medicine work has really compared to the depth of surrender that I've been brought to while keeping small people alive and while having to really let go of all of my wants and needs and desires and identities that I have so meticulously built for such a long time, working on myself and creating this persona of, oh, this is who I am. And those are the beautiful spaces I hold and retreats, and you can come with me and do all these things. Complete surrender, because babies are teething or they are not sleeping. And the mind goes through all these torturous experiences of truly having to let go over and over all day again. And I guess who I am speaking as today on the other side of two very intense postpartum experiences and now having two children under 5 is someone much more grounded in my sense of self that I have ever been, but without all this sprinkle of, wow, adventure and spiritual exploration. It just feels really real for me now. This isn't to criticize myself, but to see maybe also my own ungroundedness and being a seeker without having this real experience of becoming a parent. So we do live in a sacred valley, and my children are growing up at this moment barefoot and all day, every day in nature. And in some ways it makes it easy, in other ways it is extremely challenging. We were just speaking about this briefly before. You know, we live in a place where very few people look like us, and I am holding space for something very powerful where my children are coming into the world already sensing that they're somewhat different than everybody around them. We are here right now with my husband in a very strong experience of parenting, where all of our other practices, activities, things that we were doing and how we were serving humanity has been put on a back burner. So who I am right now is a mother. Then I can say a space holder, because I have some things coming up this year, but not so many as I used to. And then I am also an author. My book, Miracles from the Abyss, was published 5 years ago, and I have this desire to write more about what we potentially will be exploring today, but I think it will have to wait some years before I can really have time to sit down and, you know, do what I need to do. As you notice, it took quite a lot of acrobatics to even have this conversation. So who I am, I have no idea. Who am I, Jason?
So one of the interesting things you mentioned, and obviously a lot of people listening to this podcast are familiar with plant medicine. Probably most of them have worked with some sort of plant medicine. So this idea of a ceremony and this idea of surrendering to a ceremony, and I think maybe on the surface that idea of becoming a parent and how that is a very big ceremony, or the biggest ceremony, as you said. I think that maybe makes sense to a lot of people. Certainly, if people are a parent and they've worked with plant medicines, but I think obviously until one has gone through that process, it's maybe a bit vague too. And I would imagine to some people that may even seem like it doesn't resonate. Like, okay, sure, being a parent is great and it's a challenge, but to also put it in terms of a ceremony, a spiritual practice, I think for many people it can be a vague idea too. Can you speak a bit about that, about what you mean about that, of it being a ceremony experience and that idea of surrender, like what that means to you, not only in a plant medicine experience, but also as being a mother?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a beautiful question. And yes, probably not for everybody that makes sense. So, in my experience of communing with various spirit medicines, ceremony in that context has always meant arriving with intention, being brought into spaces and places that are far outside of my comfort zone because they often challenge and question who I attach myself to be. They challenge the stories that I've been telling myself about who I am. They challenge my identities, my attachments, and allow me and force me and ultimately nudge me to rediscover my truest self over and over and over again. There is a sense of being stripped of anything and everything that is untrue, that truly stands in the way of us embodying what we have been put on this earth to embody. And I think our individual histories, especially our childhoods, very much imprint how we come into the world and who we identify ourselves to be as, or how we present ourselves, how we guard ourselves, what we protect, what we put forth. And medicine ceremonies seem to, at least for me and for many people I know, challenge that status quo, seem to really present us with a lot of questions and seem to often very visually show us otherwise. And I found the same to be true for parenting, for motherhood. Example, when my daughter was about 18 months, she's now almost 5, she went through a phase where she was exploring boundaries through hitting. And this luckily didn't last long, but she went through a very visceral phase of hitting me on the face just to see what reaction she will get, how that will look, what will happen. I have a very painful history of being hit as a child by my father. There was a lot of physical violence in our home. And I thought that I processed it all. With plants, with meditation, with all my yogic practice, I was free. And then that phase arrived and she started hitting me on my face. And the first few times it happened, the rage that started surging in my body took me by complete surprise. And I actually had to sit down on my hands and breathe because the instant reaction was to hit her back. Of course, I'm not going to hit an 18-month-old child. I am not perpetuating that story that was probably running through my lineage for many generations. But the internalized idea of being free of was very much challenged by my child arriving and shining the light on everything that was still unregulated in my nervous system, still so easily triggered by that reverberating memory of violence, of being hurt without having anything to do with it, of no say, no interaction leading to it, no warning, no partaking, no causing it, etc. And so I think in that sense and from that lens, for those of us who are parents, I do believe that children are a gift of that light shining into the darkest corners of our awareness, of our psyche, just like plants can do, showing us what yet is there that we haven't brought forth and fully embraced, what is there that we have been lying to ourselves about. And, I have really held myself to a lot of standards over the years of holding space for other people and creating transformative healing containers so that others can take this journey back home to themselves, can reclaim their sovereignty, can re-explore their relationship to God. That has built a certain identity, a certain sense of self. And then I do see myself losing it with my children daily. Daily, I am a parent that is not this conscious floating on the air fairy mother, but just a very real human getting triggered by small humans doing everything I'm asking them not to do. And they both happen to be at an age where yes, some things can be explained, but other things are very real exploration of their sense of identity and ego forming and needing to be disruptive to understand a place in a constellation, etc. So from that entire picture, ceremony is this very daily being forced to get real with who I am in this moment. What am I bringing to the table? What are the parts of myself that I would rather pretend are not there, rather not look at because they're not as pretty as I would like to present myself to the world? What is asked of me? And I think plants ask us to let go of the load, to stop carrying the load of everything that we have taken on as ours, whether again from childhood parents or just our lifestyle choices, life experiences into adulthood, and be in the present moment with who we truly are. And when we tune into who we truly are in the present moment, it is loving awareness. I believe that is the unconditional ultimate truth for all humans. When we drop defenses, pretenses, and are with the breath, with the eye contact in this moment, there is peace and there is love and there's quiet and there is stillness. And I find motherhood is asking me to be that. Just like plants have been asking me. Some of the most amazing ceremonies that I've had were those when I was able to just be, like that ultimate holy grail of ayahuasca, just being and noticing what arises, not reacting, not responding, not starting to converse and trying to get all the answers, being. I always found that that was like a portal directly into everything that's ever been created in the universe. And children are exactly that. The most beautiful manifest proof of God.
So we met. I don't know how long ago. I mean, the fact that you said we interviewed the last time 5 years ago. I'm not even sure. I want to think how long ago we met, but we met working together at a big, well-known ayahuasca center called the Temple of the Way of Light in the Peruvian Amazon, and you were running retreats. You were, I believe, at that time offering yoga retreats in conjunction with ayahuasca work, and I remember they were very popular. They were very well received. So you were very successful in that way. You wrote a book. So I think you were fulfilling a lot of roles. I would imagine desires you had. And this may be speaking to a smaller audience because, certainly people who work with plants or have some sort of spiritual practice, that often is not their actual work. It's just something they're doing for their own benefit. But as someone who did embody this work, what was that calling for you to become a mother? Because it's something that and this may be a bit of an uncomfortable subject, but hopefully we'll get into some more aspects of that as well. But I think especially for women, it's a reality because in this work, one of the realities is it's infinite. There's always more to learn. There's always more to grow. There's always another dieta to do. There's always another ceremony to do. There's always another practice to learn. And so I think a lot of people, as kind of you alluded to in the beginning, there's this infinite quest of more, of growth. And there's something very beautiful about that. But as you said, part of what the plants were asking you or asking people in general is also to begin to embody something, this physical reality. And we do live in a place of a physical reality where we are bound by laws of time and entropy. And so that idea, of being a mother or a father, but I think it's different for being a mother at some point, because it is such a big process, as you're beginning to allude to, one does have to at least temporarily begin to put those other choices on hold. What was that like for you? What was that calling? I would imagine there's a struggle, like so many women that I know that begin to go through that process of losing an identity, changing an identity, having to basically put the known life on hold, beginning to shed all sorts of layers. What was that like for you? And this is a big question, but I think it's something that so many people actually deal with. And again, not just in a plant medicine world, but any time someone begins to take on that role of a mother, there's a massive change. I was actually reminded, our friend Jessica Beijing, I was talking to her one day, and she was saying she was sitting with the Kogi, the group of people in the Sierra Nevada of Colombia. And this can be taken many ways, but either she said or a friend of hers asked this Kogi elder why, like, what was the reason behind climate change? And they said that people had forgotten their roles, that men and women had forgotten their roles of, I think even specifically sexuality, which was quite interesting. But, kind of tying back into that idea of a role, and it's a huge shift of a role. So I know this is a big question, but kind of that initial calling from, as you said, when we spoke the last time, of really working, being actively engaged in something, having this very, very clear and fulfilled path, because, I think that's also important. Like you were successful in what you were doing, to then having this calling to be a mother.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I firstly want to start by saying that for a lot of my adulthood, I held on to the story that I will never be a mother and that I don't want to be a mother. I kept, whenever someone brought up the topic of children, kept saying, no, this is not for me, because the identity, yes, being successful with the identity that I built with that was of this yoga teacher and breathwork facilitator who travels the world and hosts retreats in Bali and Peru and wherever else. And I loved it. I had a lot of fun doing what I love doing, and I have met amazing people, spent many years living in wonderful places like India. We met a decade ago, almost, by the way. So then I arrived in the Amazon jungle, and as you know, met my husband very quickly, instantly, and our getting together was facilitated by ayahuasca. We both, in the ceremony, I think, 3 days after meeting for the first time, were shown in our own individual psyches and our own individual consciousness that we will spend the rest of our lives together, that we will have these two beautiful children, and, this is what you will create, this is where you will live, all of that. And at the end of the ceremony, I said to the medicine, like, how do I know I'm not projecting this? Like, how can this be possible? That, I have just arrived here. I'm not looking for a relationship. You're telling me all of this about this guy I just met. And ayahuasca said, don't worry about it. You will never know how this works. You'll never understand. But he will come to you right now and he will tell you everything I told you. And that's when I opened my eyes and I saw Al get up from his mat, and he came over to me and he said, like, listen, this is going to be a little bit crazy, but this is what I just experienced in the ceremony. And we basically, for whatever reason, were both shown exactly the same things, and, got married within a few weeks and are still together in a very beautiful marriage. However, one of the first things I said to him on the back of that ceremony was, look, if you want to be with me, you just have to know that I don't want to have children. Like, yes, for whatever reason, we saw these two beautiful blonde children, this boy and a girl, but that's not my timeline. I don't want to have children. I was so adamant about that. And it was really only for me through the container of this conscious relationship with a man who finally made me feel so safe that the core wounding, all to do with my father figure, was able to come up for healing, that I started to reclaim a very true, very deeply rooted desire to become a mother. It took a good few years of us really orienting our life around dietas, around plant medicine work. Eventually we were dieting together, sitting together in small rooms and doing really deep healing work in that container of a safe relationship, that the identity that I built around, no, children are not for me, I'm this traveling yoga teacher, it started to kind of melt off in a way. And the more our relationship truly strengthened and straightened how we walk through life, the more the defense mechanisms started to drop off, the more I began to integrate my childhood experiences truly because of this safe love that was holding me, the more the yearning to become a mother started to come forth. And towards the end of 2019, we were both very clear, like we started to feel ready to call in a child. And actually at the Temple of the Way of Light, the very last time both of us worked there on site, we asked a couple of healers who are in a relationship together, very wonderful people, if they could sing to us a song known as Warmi, an Icaro that brings often, when used for this purpose, a connection to the soul of a child that one may want to summon earthside. And again, it was an amazing experience of both of us sitting next to each other and being sung to by two healers at once, male and a female. And we both, again, had the same vision of this little boy and a little girl dancing and laughing. And they both were saying to me, "Mama, we can wait to see you." And it just felt very beautifully orchestrated by the plants. And to answer your question specifically about the shedding of the identity, when I became pregnant, when we conceived, which was like just under a year later, this was when all the 2020 things were already happening in the world. So my work anyway massively shifted from in-person retreats in transformative containers here in Peru, or working for places like the Temple of the Way of Light, into working online. That was very much the adjustment that 2020 brought into my work. So I personally at first didn't feel any conflict. I was writing my book, I was mentoring people, I was, working on Zoom daily, holding space. And then when my daughter was born, I knew that I wanted to take a year of sabbatical at least, because it didn't feel like there was a bandwidth, energetic bandwidth, or desire to really be in such intimate space as I share with people, listening to what they are going through and truly offering myself as someone who's accompanying them when I was accompanying my daughter through incarnating into human experience. So there was a very organic decision to step back. And the work that I am in service of is a huge ask, energetically speaking. And it didn't really feel like I had bandwidth for both. And then when I returned to holding space, at first I just dabbled in it. And I, explored my edges and what kind of battery I have. And it took, I think, 18 months. Uma was 18 months before I held my first retreat again. And on that occasion, it was a retreat just for one guest, for a private client. And I think she was 2.5 when we came back to hosting group retreats together with Al. And the ego death that happened with her birth, for me, was more because of how traumatic her birth was than on the back of becoming a mother per se. I had a very different birth plan than what unfolded, and her birth ended up being near death for both of us, incredibly medicalized, intervention-based. Everything that I could have ever said I didn't want to happen when envisioning my birth was what happened. And so I really had to surrender to what I was served. And the trauma from that experience, the trauma from being hospitalized, from her being hospitalized, there was so much, really led me into probably the darkest night of the soul I've ever experienced. And it was through a dieta with one of the trees that I have been dieting for many, many years, Noyerao, that I actually finally saw light through that experience. And the big ego death that came through was really having to let go of this identity of this very embodied, holistic woman that I held myself to be, because Uma's birth showed me all the ways in which I still was not sovereign. I do deeply, deeply believe that absolutely everything that happens as manifest is in a relationship with our thoughts and what we believe and the state of our consciousness. And when a birth like that happens, you don't wake up the next day thinking, how could I have caused it? How can I be possibly responsible for something that, in my case, was in the 0.2% probability, statistically speaking? Nothing in my body, nothing in my state of health would have ever pointed that something like that may happen. So I can't say that the next day I already started inquiring, well, why? What within me could be responsible? But it took me, a good 2 years of really healing and being willing to go there. And eventually the answer became so very clear. I saw the very thoughts that were still somewhere deep within me reverberating to do with a childhood and teenage years and early adulthood story of trauma, of addiction, of violence, of abuse that was still maybe somewhere on a cellular level causing this very deep imprint of unworthiness and of self-sabotage. And I could trace it back and see the result of that birth as an outcome. And so the ego death that came with that, it wasn't so much I was a yoga teacher, now I'm not. It was, wow, everything I believe myself to be has been challenged by this very experience that is a gift a painful gift, but a gift from God, from life, from my soul, likely having sequenced this painful yet awakening experience. I can truly see myself. I can truly see my own thoughts. I can truly see who I am. And so then, as my child was growing, the identity of even how I want to hold spaces for others started to shapeshift in relationship to what I was experiencing in motherhood. And to circle back to what I was saying earlier, I think every day in parenthood we are challenged in our beliefs and how we hold ourselves and how we respond. Do we react? How patient are we? How grounded are we? How radically responsible or not for our thoughts and our emotions? Our children mirror everything. And so I feel that what I started to offer then when I did come back to retreats was very different than pre-motherhood. And when we felt ready to expand our family and call in that second child that we both did see, and lo and behold, we do have a girl and a boy, and they look exactly like what we saw in all of those visions. So here is a little a little piece to reflect with on what's really happening in this experience that we call life. When we started to just welcome our son Micah into our family field as an idea, as a possibility, as a desire, I then already knew that what I have experienced with my daughter, that near-death birth, it will never happen again. I knew that, one, it had to happen because it had to show me certain things. And also, of course, she's co-creating this with me. Her soul also, for whatever reason, has chosen to arrive on earth through that experience. But I knew that we did this together also to liberate the lineage, entire lineage in my family, both sides. There's so much trauma, so much birth trauma. I mean, this is a whole other conversation, but I am from Poland. So my ancestors, up to my parents really, have just experienced war, violence, poverty, regimes, Holocaust, and safety. There has never been really a period where people lived in prosperity, ancestrally speaking, up until my generation, in peace, prosperity, safety. And I knew that my daughter has also helped me to take responsibility for liberating the lineage. So when we felt ready for Micah to join our family, I knew, okay, I'm going to walk a very radically different path this time. My pregnancy will be different. My birth will be different. I am choosing to become this ancestor who puts the foot down and says no more. Like, we are not doing this anymore. We are not giving our power away to the system. We're not perpetuating the story that life and birth especially are trauma and pain. I want to show myself and my children that I am in full embodiment and that I am radically responsible for every thought and everything I bring into creation and co-creation with them. And again, something that I think plants so beautifully reflect or, show in our faces. Where are we not radically responsible? So to just wrap this up, I feel that another ego death for me unfolded. Again, I used to hold retreats and now I don't, but I had this very incredibly challenging first experience. Who do I want to become now? What kind of birth do I want to co-create with my son? How do I want to bring him earthside, already having had experienced everything I wouldn't wish for my child to go through with my first? I had to go to all of the darkest corners of my psyche the entire year that I was pregnant with him to really confront every single thought that could have potentially sabotaged my choice to free birth. Free birth meaning I choose to have an unassisted birth where I didn't have a single provider, when it was just me birthing my baby, how I believe, we have done it for 200,000 years. And I knew that to take that level of responsibility and to really create my experience, I had to go to every most forgotten corner of my own mind and confront myself and really die to all the stories, to all the fears, to all the remnants of yearning to be always in control, to have the last say, to, be the one in charge, and to be willing to surrender fully to God's will.
That's really beautifully put. One of the ideas, and it's I think in a lot of plant medicine traditions, you hear this idea of power that, and power is a really tricky word too, because of how we're raised or our worldview, we can have a very negative relationship to that idea of power. But ultimately, like anything, there's a duality. I mean, a gun is neither good or bad. It can be used to defend oneself. It can be used to kill someone. My fists are not inherently good or bad. They can be used to protect myself, to protect someone else. They can be used to kill someone. I'm not saying my fists are like super potent or something. But that idea of power, and even in English, we use that word like empowering, and empowering is usually has a very good connotation to it. Something that's seen as empowering is very beneficial, and so I think in that way, a lot of traditions speak of that idea of empowering, of having power, and you used a very, I think, powerful word also in this idea of responsibility, of taking responsibility for things. It's always a bit of a tricky way of speaking about these things, and I think you did it really beautifully, and maybe if you could elaborate a little more, because it's this idea of having power over your life or having responsibility over your life. It's a slippery slope, in that on the one hand, people can look at that and they can look at what they would perceive to be negative things that have happened in their life and say, well, that's not my fault, or I don't have responsibility over for that. And that's a legitimate worldview. But for whether that's good or bad or how we want to perceive that, it is disempowering. There's nothing then that you can do to begin to emerge from that. Mm-hmm. And so I think that experience you went through, and again, you spoke of it very beautifully. How would you, and you touched on a number of points, but if you could maybe elaborate a bit on that, and also maybe to people who are thinking about that, because it's always such a fine line of what is that role of responsibility in my life, having power over in my life, looking at my life and seeing from the past, like, are there things that I can learn from? How do I grow from those things? While at the same time, not blaming ourselves, not making ourselves into a victim or making someone else into a victim. Like it's a very tricky line, because obviously, for example, like you take it to an extreme, a woman is raped, and obviously you wouldn't say that that's her fault. And yet, at the same time, like what you were saying is that the birth that you had, there was patterns in yourself, beliefs, thoughts that you saw could have contributed to that. And by actually being honest with yourself, by looking at that, you were able, in a way, to transmute that, to empower yourself, to then make better choices, to shift your thought patterns. Can you speak more about that? Because again, I think that's a subject that people really struggle with. And I think sometimes when it's spoken of in a way of maybe not really having a lived world experience of that, and we just say things like, of course, like we're responsible for our lives, or we shouldn't be a victim, or all of these things. But it's a much different place of wisdom or power when you're actually speaking to that from something that like really, really touched you, and especially in this way of like, as you said, a dark night of the soul.
Mm-hmm. I think a beautiful inquiry is always to wonder, what is love teaching us in these moments? What is love teaching me? What am I asked in relationship to love, to learn, to reclaim, to embody it when these painful events happen? In my personal cosmovision, I do believe that my soul, pre my arrival in this incarnation on planet Earth, has agreed, decided, contracted to go through certain learning experiences so that my journey towards the remembrance of full sovereignty in my relationship to life, to God, is the most, perhaps fast-paced learning, the most impactful. It unfolds in this lifetime. My experience has been that the most painful events in my story so far, I'm 40 to be 41 this year, and plenty has happened in those 40 years. When I look at them through this inquiry of, well, what was love teaching me? They're all pointing me back to God. experiences of physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, psychological abuse, experiences of addiction. I mean, I've had full-on blown for a few years cocaine addiction. It really took me to the bottom of the bottom of the bottom of the rock bottom. It all eventually showed me all those places in which, on the back of my childhood experiences, I did not believe myself worthy. I did not believe myself deserving of love, of validation, of acceptance. I believed myself as not belonging. I believed myself as ridden with shame. I believed myself as all those things. And love was trying to teach me otherwise. And if I can look at these experiences, of course, it wasn't my fault that it wasn't my fault that my father was beating me up. It wasn't his fault either. The same was done to him by his parents. His parents survived the Second World War. Nobody knows where my grandma comes from because she was just found in a field in like 1940 or 41. There is so much that happens in the lineage, and we can point fingers, which makes it easier not to take that radical responsibility. We can make it about that perpetrator, which then puts us in the position of a victim. So we kind of give our power away and we say, well, all these things happened to me and this is who I am on the back of it today. All these things happened, and yes, they had influence on who I am, but they are not who I am. I am not those events. I am not my father doing all those things to me as a child. This has happened because likely that and much more was done to him. And to be able to really disarm it from personal finger pointing, I think allows us to liberate quite a lot of power that we can then harness as a life force energy that we can put into something else. That energy that is really wasted and leaking in shame and blame and finger pointing and, being angry with the world for everything that has happened. I think we can really beautifully invest it into creation. But the creation can only happen if we're connected to love and if we are channeling love, if we're embodying love. So for this personal story that I shared, what I really got to the bottom of, and this is very tender, this is very, very much like the depth of my psyche, but eventually after 2 years of doing the healing work and really trying to understand, well, how could this have happened? I was preparing for this beautiful, empowering, holistic birth, and I'm a yoga teacher, and my blood work is perfect, and my body is so healthy, and I eat all the right things, And then this birth happens that, like I said, it's 0.2% probability of emergency, huge emergency. And how could it have happened? It would have been easy for me to be blaming whatever, be angry with God or angry with life for this, event. I discovered the thought that I was cultivating in my subconscious mind, that because of the amount of sexual abuse that there was in my story, especially during the time when I was addicted to drugs, a lot of things happened. There was a belief, I am not worthy to have my child. Why would my child want to be born naturally when I have been through all these experiences? This is a very, very, very big thought to be coming into motherhood with. And yes, that birth was an extreme manifestation of that thought, but I do believe that life was showing me, look at how you are actually not fully embodying who you are. Look at how you're still judging yourself and shaming yourself for trauma. Trauma that didn't happen because you chose it. Trauma that happened on the back of you trying to numb from pain, trying to look for your father in all the wrong places, trying to find God through out-of-body substance experiences, because those experiences were helping you not to feel a lifelong buildup of pain and shame. So ultimately, I was dissociated, even though I was living this identity of a very embodied yoga teacher, da-da-da-da. And I do believe that that birth was a gift of showing me, well, where this is still not true. What is lurking in those darkest corners of my mind that I didn't have the courage to go to yet before that birth happened? And what I can say about reclaiming power is that while this process was incredibly brutal and tender and ultimately really took me and my daughter to the edge, we both almost died, I do believe that it was the biggest gift, because it woke me up to how I have been deceiving myself and lying to myself. And it allowed me to truly reclaim who I am, to finally forgive a lot of parts of my story that I was carrying on like a load on my back and kind of, not really willing to look at it too much because it's heavy and it's dark and it happened, but, let's put it all on that period of time. Let's forget about it. I really had to go there. And I had to make peace with all the facets of myself that were the hardest to make peace with. And the life force that this freed, wow, the sources of creation that started moving through me, the offerings that I suddenly was able and willing to create, the spaces that I was suddenly inspired to weave for other people is amazing. But it was a gift of stepping into greater authenticity. And for me, power isn't me walking around and saying, oh, I'm so powerful because I've done all these things. And, I'm so powerful because this is what I've studied, or these are the dietas I did. These are the 700 ceremonies I sat in. My power is my ability to stay in my heart in the moments that are trying to get me out of it. My power is the ability to forgive. My power is the ability to be at peace in the moments that are trying to distract me from peace. My power is to be in the world in this like birthing canal that we're collectively finding ourselves in right now, and hold the light, hold the love, hold the Christ consciousness, hold the presence of possibility of the highest possible outcome for all of us, not just my side of the story, but all humanity. That is true power for me. And I think that power is a byproduct and effect of us stepping fully into our truth and being willing to confront everything that is not that.
And what was that process like for you? I mean, like having that experience, this dark night of the soul, and then emerging from that. And then also, I would imagine just the sheer responsibility of having a child and a relation. And I know you're moving, different environments. So what was that in you? Was it a process of self-inquiry? Was it a process of just like, okay, like something happened and I need to find resolution for that? Like, what was your path? Because I think it's one thing for people to realize, okay, like maybe there's something there. Maybe I'm tapping into something. I see that there could be certain patterns that led me to that. But for you, what was that process of like of actually beginning to take the initiative to actually go into that?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, it wasn't straightforward and it took a while too. I want to be fully transparent about it. I didn't just wake up one day and I had all these realizations. At first, I was simply incredibly traumatized. I was living out of my body. I just survived a massive surgery. I was put under for that birth. I didn't have a positive experience being in a hospital, and there was quite a lot of medical abuse and psychological abuse from the medical staff. It was just dark. And then, I leave the hospital after a week and I am with a newborn and we're not sleeping and there's the breastfeeding, there's all of it. And at first, I just simply didn't have the capacity to even start looking at what has happened. I was trying to survive having a newborn baby for the first time while truly operating on cortisol and adrenaline, living slightly outside of my body for the most part. And it caught up with me when my daughter was about 1 year old. I started not sleeping. I just started having panic attacks as I went to sleep. And at first, I couldn't quite connect the dots. And over time, it became clear to me, oh my gosh, of course I'm having a panic attack as I'm about to sleep. They put me to sleep during the moment of my life that I waited for almost a year. There was an imprint in my nervous system. When I go to sleep, bad things happen. When I go to sleep, something that I want to be awake for might happen. And so my body was purging the absolute terror of what it was like to be put under in a moment that I waited for, being pregnant. And from that moment on, when the dots connected, I entered into a huge healing period where I was supporting myself, my body, and predominantly my nervous system with a lot of practices. Yes, plants. I sat in quite a lot of ceremonies. I did a dieta with my teacher, but also somatic experiencing, using a body-based inquiry to really speak to my nervous system and to my physical body and go into all those places that held on to terror, that held on to sense of loss of authority, loss of agency, disempowerment, that have felt violated, that have felt that there was no consent, etc. And it was a very, very long, tender journey. And I think the biggest and most scary experience in that time was that sleep was very tender for me. And, you know, I think in general, motherhood has a lot of lost sleep, but to experience insomnia that comes with a panic attack when you have already not slept for a year, that really broke me. And I really fully and very intimately understood why sleep deprivation is used as a torture method, because the mind breaks, truly. When you don't sleep, the mind breaks. And I think there is a very biological kind of a fight or flight response. Like, I will die if I don't sleep. Therefore, whatever I perceive as a threat to me not being able to sleep, I kind of have to interfere with it. I have to let go of it. I have to fight against it. And at least for me, prolonged deprivation of sleep has really taken me to places that were very scary, very, very scary. So the dark night of the soul wasn't just me sitting and crying because I had a traumatic birth. It was me being literally broken, entire being coming undone as I was reclaiming bit by bit a sense of regulation, a sense of safety, a remembrance that my body is my temple. I am safe in my body. It is safe to be in my body. It is safe to be in the world. Things happen, yes, but they do not determine who I am and who I am here to be. And eventually, I want to say it took a good 9 months before I started sleeping normally, without like a panic of what's going to happen tonight, without having to support my body with millions of supplements and melatonins and all of that. And I think the following year, before we actually conceived our son, was a very slow return towards trust between me and myself, me and my body, the capacity of my body to birth my baby naturally. And eventually that healing turned into this very kind of lioness energy of, I'm ready to reclaim this for myself and for my children and for their children. And I'm ready to turn the story around from something very traumatic that happened that stripped me of everything into this phoenix rising. I co-create with God, and I am desiring to have this experience now and to end this, at that point, 38 years of physical abuse and trauma and sexual abuse and trauma and emotionally, it's been just reverberating through my story in many, many ways. And even when living clean, even when devoted to a life of connection to my body, my soul, plant medicines, yogic practices, tantric practices, meditation, it still came through my daughter's birth. There was still a thread showing me you're not yet free of this because you haven't claimed it fully. So the journey was very long, and the journey really asked of me to show up fully and to be willing to show up even when I'm exhausted because I'm parenting a small child, and to keep choosing myself over and over and keep choosing my truth over and over so that I can create something very new and long lasting for the entire lineage. And most importantly for myself, so I can really embody the freedom of who I am here to be, not the stories of all those things that have happened. Mm-hmm.
You touched on this idea of the medicalization of childbirth, and I think perhaps more people are becoming aware of that. But in most societies, and not just Western society, because most of the world is really an offshoot, I would say, of Western society now. But birth is just accepted that that's done in a hospital or a medicalized system. And when we were planning our first birth, it was very interesting and also surprising to me that in a way I'd never thought of it, because my wife and I, mainly her, because it was ultimately her choice, wanted a more natural birth. But that idea that it was said very well to me, and again, surprising that I hadn't thought of that, but that usually when you're going to a hospital, it's because something's wrong, you're unwell. Whereas birth is usually quite the opposite of that. It's the sign of fertility. It's the sign of life. It's a sign of abundance. And so it's, on the one hand, it's seemingly strange that those two things are interrelated. Obviously, on the one hand, you benefited from a medicalization of that birth process in your first birth, and as I'm sure we'll speak about more, and the opposite of that for your second birth. But just as a whole, because I know it's something you've thought about and looked into, Like obviously in societies before what we would consider hospitals now, that the process of birth was very different. You had usually women who were very specialized in the birthing process. It was usually done in the home or some ceremonial space. You were surrounded by family or doctors of birthing, like very specific doctors, usually women, midwives, doulas. It was often a very joyous process. It was an act of celebration. There was support after that. There was very often periods of even isolation for 40 days where just the mother and the child spent that time together, getting to know each other. I would imagine there's also even ancient wisdom in there of really not exposing the child to outside viruses and parasites and things for the first 40 days when they're very sensitive. I think there's probably a lot going on that we've forgotten about. But can you speak a bit about, from your experience of and I know this is a vague term, and obviously birthing was different in different traditional societies, but from a more generic traditional point, like what that process of birth was like, and potentially some of the drawbacks of that too, but what were the benefits of that? Like why would that be considered potentially more ideal? And it does seem like there's kind of a renaissance of people beginning to go back to that and even to question that, because again, for so many people, that's not even in their worldview that a birth would happen outside of a hospital. I mean, even I can't remember if I was speaking to you or some other friends who gave birth in Peru, and I mean, even legally, it's very difficult. Like, it's very tricky to not have a birth in a hospital setting. Like, it's not easy. So how did that happen? And again, just speaking more of that idea of a traditional birth, like what does that look like? And why do you think there is something very beautiful about that?
Yeah. Yeah, this is a very important conversation. And for anybody who's listening, who's like, I'm not interested in birth, I want to just prelude by saying this is really about power and collective conditioning and systems, and ultimately a deeply buried human longing for sovereignty. Because to really understand how birth looks today, we have to really zoom way, way, way out. Humans have been giving birth for roughly 200,000 of years. Roughly, female humans have been birthing humans for 200,000 of years. So if birth was inherently a deadly condition, if women routinely died of childbirth, our species would...
To interject with that, I mean, I don't know if you saw, but they recently found in China a skull, which they think is basically a sister species of Homo sapien, essentially the same, that's 1 million years old. So
wow.
I would say that the timeline is probably considerably older.
Amazing. Okay. Even better from my point. So women have been birthing for 1 million of years. If birth was an illness that the doctors have to rescue us from, our species simply would not exist. We simply would not have survived, especially if we consider all the adversities of the climate, living on planet Earth before, sanitization, when people were still hunting and gathering, etc. So birth has always carried risk, yes, but it has never been a pathological event by default. And for most of human history, healthy women giving birth under supportive conditions survived again and again, generation after generation. We are here now. So maybe you've heard this, shared around. I certainly did. There is this modern myth that the modern medicine, the doctors have essentially saved women from dying from birth because they were just dropping dead left, right, and center before obstetrics were created. It's a modern myth. It's a very convenient one, but it frames women's bodies as fundamentally broken, and it positions intervention as the sole reason why we are still here. But now the history in general of birth is really complex, because some of the worst spikes in maternal death in the context of birth begin to occur when birth was moved into the medical settings. So 18th, 19th century, before hygiene was really understood. Doctors started coming, attending births with unwashed hands, with dirty instruments, doctors experimenting on women. We know a lot about this now. And it was causing massive outbreaks of infection. So the early medicine appearing in the context of birth wasn't initially saving women from it at all. And in many cases, it made birth much more dangerous before It offered practices that, made it safer. I'm sorry, I just unplugged my charger as I talk about this. Here we go. So it's also important to think about, the medical practices that we now would probably find outrageous that once were considered advanced care. Like a lot of things that are now completely unthinkable were offered to women routinely. Early 20th century, women were birthing under morphine. It was called twilight sleep. Women were drugged, sedated, completely dissociated, restrained, unable to remember their births. It was considered a privilege to birth your baby without really having experienced the pain, without having really been there. So babies, as a result, were born drugged up with completely dysregulated nervous systems. And then up until the 60s, this isn't long ago, my mom was born in the 60s, my mom is still here, up until the 60s, X-rays were used in pregnancy to assess fetal position and, what was happening within the womb. This was exposing mother and babies to such insane amounts of radiations that only when a generation of babies was born with cancer, with insane brain deformations, etc., this was finally understood as a big risk and no longer carried out. So, when we think about what was brought into women's experience of birth through the medical system, we're also talking about things like being strapped down, being forced to have your legs in stirrups, being shaved, being denied movement, often denied food and water because there were beliefs around actually the baby will be born quicker if you're not eating, or you might have a C-section, so you shouldn't be eating. And then routinely, mothers were separated from their babies. Nursery is a word that comes from the hospital setting where after the birth, nurses took babies to separate rooms so that the mothers could rest and the baby would only be brought back to the mother so the mother could breastfeed the baby when the nurses deemed it appropriate or, the schedule was aligning. So many of these stories seem outrageous, but they're very much part of my own lineage. My mother, my grandmother, when they told the stories of their birth, those were the words they used. There was so much abuse, so much dissociation, and all of this was called modern medicine. Some of these practices were once considered progress. And I think that really matters because as humanity, we have this tendency to get really infatuated with progress, really drunk on progress. And we can see that what is understood as a standard, especially as a medical standard, is not a fixed truth. It evolves over time. And what feels normal for one generation often feels completely unthinkable for the next. So yes, the modern obstetrics eventually brought genuine life-saving procedures, tools, antibiotics, blood transfusions, surgical techniques like the one that saved my daughter's life. And they matter. They do matter. They save lives. They save lives when there is an emergency. But alongside of this life-saving, birth has become industrialized. It's been standardized, protocol-driven, optimized for efficiency, monetized. In most countries, it is usually monetized. There is institutional control, there is liability management. So over the last just 50 years, this system has completely changed birth from something that has been unfolding for a million, 200,000 million, whatever that is, into now just a few decades of a completely different experience. And, women, yes, died before in birth, as they do now today. And actually in many countries right now, there is a really big increase in maternal death, and it's coming from these completely unnecessary interventions. I think the biggest, most shocking statistic here is that C-section, the surgical birth, once was really rare, and it was reserved only for true emergencies. Now, in some countries, Western countries, the statistics are up to 40%. 40% of all birth is surgical. This doesn't track with suddenly there is an increase in emergencies or suddenly 40% of female bodies don't know how to birth their babies. Again, we're talking a million of years of our species having had survived. It tracks with systems, it tracks with incentives, it tracks with this very medicalized clinical culture and protocols and loss of sovereignty in us as humanity. So beyond the surgery, every aspect of pregnancy and birth is now medicalized. We no longer live in villages where there are wise women Many of us no longer live connected to nature. We are sterile. We are under bright lights. We are in buildings. We are told what to do by the system that claims to have the wisdom that we no longer possess. So when women are birthing now, there is continuous electronic monitoring of the baby. You cannot move. You have to be on your back because that's comfortable for the doctor. Then there is a labor induction, which for me is like this most insane aspect of giving birth in hospital. 40 weeks, day one arrives of your pregnancy. You go to the hospital. You are given synthetic Pitocin, which is a synthetic form of oxytocin, as if the baby is sitting in a womb with a calendar being like, ooh, 40 weeks, gotta come out. It doesn't work like that. Biology is so incredibly genius. Our bodies are genius. Birth will begin. Well, the hormonal matrix is perfect. And then what happens is that when women are receiving Pitocin, it's a synthetic hormone mimicking oxytocin. However, it bypasses the very loving state that oxytocin activates in us. Oxytocin is a hormone that we are surged by when we make love, when we are gazing into our children's eyes, when we pet super stuffed animals, when we feel cozy and safe and just, it's so good to be me. Pitocin simply causes uterine contractions, but because they are not naturally caused by the woman's body itself, those contractions are described as some of the most painful. They are not natural. So then the next step for a woman to survive those contractions is to have epidural, a spinal injection that immobilizes her from the waist down. So then the doctor has to stand above her head and yell, push, 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 which some of us know from films, because the woman does not feel that she needs to bear the baby down. So the birth hasn't changed, the system has changed. And the unnecessary procedures that once were saved only for emergencies are now normalized. We believe that we need to have a doctor inject us with a synthetic hormone on day one of 40 weeks of being pregnant for the birth to begin. Birth has entirely moved into hospitals. And the care for pregnant women and for postpartum became completely fragmented. Instead of trust in our physiology, there is risk management, there is time pressure, there is, staffing in hospitals. Many women tell the story of a nurse or a midwife or a doctor coming and being like, I got to pick up my child from the nursery, you better birth this baby or we're going to cut you open. I mean, there's a completely different reason for decision making than a female needs while bringing life earthside. And of course, again, modern medicine can save lives when used appropriately, but harm overall didn't disappear. Now the harm changed form. There is so much maternal mortality that we don't talk about, from surgery complications, from unnecessary interventions. There is psychological injury from the trauma that the modern medical system inflicts on women. And the most painful part of this is that it's completely normalized and it's really rarely named. And in all of this, I think when we're talking about power and system, there is like a real psychological layer to this that really rarely gets spoken about. I think that many people have this kind of trauma bonding, loyalty to system, something that maybe can resemble like a soft form of a Stockholm syndrome. A system is positioned as a sole authority over our safety and survival. And when that happens, people often develop almost this emotional attachment to the system, even though they've been harmed by it. And trust becomes fused with identity, and a belief into that system becomes like a form of self-protection. And we saw this so clearly in 2020. Medical narratives became moral law. People were divided into good and bad, and the safe and dangerous, and compliant and irresponsible. And, some of us lost friendships. Some of us lost jobs. Fear replaced any kind of dialogue. And if anybody dared to question, it was a heresy. And consent became something that we were completely stripped of individually and collectively. There was no complexity. There was no space for conversations about complexity. And most of the harm that happened in 2020, 2021, it happened really quickly. And then just as quickly, it was normalized, forgotten, and then reframed as, well, that was necessary. So I find that what often follows trauma individually and collectively is this kind of defensive allegiance. we would rather defend the system because the system has been fused with this internal sense of safety and morality and identity. And so when that happens, the system is not just this external body, it's a completely internalized way of living. So when we're talking about birth and medicine and authority, often when this is questioned, the reaction that it causes in people is actually about their own fear and psychological safety and conditioning, which I also think helps to explain why so many women are now seeking sovereign birth. Because it isn't about outright rejecting medicine, outright rejecting the modern medicine which saves life. I think the choices to birth outside of the system in a sovereign way are often coming from women that were hurt by the system, emotionally, physically, psychologically, women who felt coerced, women who felt dismissed or rushed or overridden or treated as, kind of liabilities rather than human beings in the most powerful and vulnerable moments of their lives. I, since having had my first birth, have created an offering for women to safely process their births. And the stories that I've been hearing, wow. And yet it is normalized. So I think sovereign birth emerges as reclaiming of authority over our bodies, over our decisions, over our environment, over our right to live in a sovereign relationship to ourselves and to all of life. So I don't think it's about denial of risk. And I don't think it's about being careless or anything like that. I think it's actually about taking full power back, about total agency, sovereignty, and consent. All those things that really, when we think very honestly about the medicalized birth, we are completely robbed of.
And how would you, because also when you're speaking of a sovereign birth, I mean, there's this idea that we have essentially a say in how we give birth. And on the one extreme, that can be with essentially just ourselves, potentially no outside influence. But also there's systems like, when we were going through the process, there was a very good documentary we saw, Ina May Gaskin, I think is her name. And she was a pioneering woman in the US who has a midwifery clinic, I believe in Tennessee. And I mean, again, what to believe, but I don't think she was incorrect in that, like the numbers that they were working with, I think were even superior to hospitals, and it was being birthed in a natural way. And certainly the energetic, the experience of the women who went there was undeniably better, more happy for the women going there. So this idea of these traditional births, of using midwives, using doulas, what do you think was the role of that? I mean, obviously there's a medical knowledge of using certain plants, of knowing techniques, of knowing massage. There's an emotional component that can be there of just support, of knowing you're not alone. And then there's all the way to, I'm just going to do this on my own and to really trust in myself and my power. So could you maybe walk people, because I think it's a question a lot of women legitimately have, like how do I choose to do this? And certainly, like anything with experience, one begins to know oneself better. But what do you think are those alternative options that women have access to?
Mm-hmm. And how funny that it's an alternative option when we really think about that. Yeah, I think historically women have had women with them because it is a birth experience. It's big, it's huge, it's a ceremony. You're eventually brought into a place of, I believe, complete dissolving of a separate sense of self. A woman's body becomes a vessel to download a soul and turn it into matter and then bring it into this manifest world. Energetically, shamanically, psychologically speaking, it is asking of us to fully surrender. And I will talk about this maybe in a little bit, but, I think when we can really surrender to what the birth is meant to be, it is the most incredible non-dual experience that brings us straight into God, that brings us into remembrance, into sovereignty, into a full reclamation of our power. So to be able to be in that state, to be able to really merge into one with God, you can't really be thinking about, oh, I really need to pee, where can I pee? Or, oh, my older child is next door and they're crying, or I really need a drink of water. Someone has to be there with you holding space so that you can allow yourself to come undone and be that empty space through which life arises into the world, into creation. And so I think the wise women, historically speaking, held space for that. Brought a towel, brought water, brought food, massaged, helped, were hands-on without interfering. You know, sometimes babies are born and they don't breathe right away, or our son was born with so much mucus he couldn't really take a breath. He was just, emptying out so much liquid, and I knew what to do. But if a woman felt that she needed support, that's where I think a wise woman steps in. But the dynamic between a wise birth keeper who is there holding space without interfering versus a doctor who has the woman under bright lights on her back and subjects her to checking her internally every 20 minutes, it's a very different energetic. I cannot imagine having had this incredibly redemptive birth. And my first birth, I don't remember because I was out, which I think is actually a blessing in disguise. I cannot imagine having the birth experience that I had with my son in a hospital. I mean, I was truly like a wild woman. I was completely naked. We had plastic on the floor. I was peeing everywhere. I was changing positions constantly. I was making all sorts of noises. I cannot imagine a male figure coming and saying, oh, I have to check your cervix to see how open you are. If the cervix was open in any way, that would probably lead to my whole body contracting, because a male I am not intimate with is claiming to have the right to get inside of my body to somehow help me with the progress of my birth. Checking of the cervix does nothing. The cervix can open like this from one moment to the next, and it has nothing to do with a male hand inside of a woman's vagina. That's just, a fact. So that whole control structure that birth is now wrapped in, I think really robs women of what it traditionally has been. A threshold, a rite of passage. There is you and there is a wise woman, wise women. Women are separate. In many indigenous cultures, women would go to birth by themselves in caves, in remote areas outside of the village. Birth was trusted. Birth was seen as a part of life, and the role of a wise woman was to support, to be in service to birth. Now I feel like the doctors are there to save the woman from dying because birth is happening. And the fact that the culture, even around the pain, is so strong right now, so conditioned, most women don't even know that they actually don't need epidural to birth their babies. If their birth begins naturally, if oxytocin is the hormone that kicks in the uterine contractions, then pain isn't really something that will knock you out. There are sensations, but I personally can't say it's pain. It's a very strong somatic experience, but it's completely bearable. Again, our species has survived. But it is only bearable when you can allow yourself to go into this completely psychedelic experience, when you can allow yourself to be in the ceremony that birth is, and then just be the space through which baby moves. How can that happen if bright lights are there, there's 50 hands touching you, there's doctor telling you that, they have 20 minutes to their lunch break and you better hurry up? And some of the most horror stories that I heard from friends and clients, truly the level of abuse and really systemic power discrepancies is truly shocking. And I think what it does on a subtle level that we maybe collectively don't even recognize is causing entire generations of humans to be born in disempowerment, in abuse, in violence, in power dynamics where the mother is afraid to be in full agency over her being, where she already from the get-go gives the power away. She already trusts the man who's yelling at her, telling her when to push, rather than having this very embodied experience of, wow, I am a woman and I just birthed my baby, nobody's going to mess with me. When women feel that, systems collapse. All over the world, systems collapse. When women are truly anchored in their power and their relationship to God. Wise women held space for women to go through rites of passages like first menstruation or birth, so that the sacredness of life and our connection to nature and the cyclical nature of our bodies, it was all preserved. When it all becomes sterile and separate from nature, it's easier to control, but then it belongs to someone other than God. So somewhere along the way, birth turned from the most incredible threshold into this sickness that a doctor has to save us from. And if it wasn't for that doctor, we would have just all been dropping dead.
I mean, obviously with these things, there can be nefarious intentions behind it. I would imagine that usually most of these things started from a deep desire that all humans have, which is for something like safety. Even there's this idea now of safe spaces, and again, I think there's something in there which is genuine, like to create safety. There's something very important about that. At the same time, I think as probably more people are realizing, like having a safe space, it keeps people from growing. It keeps people from evolving. Like, even we spent time in the Amazon, and the Amazon is very safe compared to maybe what some people would imagine. And there's very real dangers there. There's serpents and jaguars, and life isn't safe in the same way that a city could be seen as a very safe place, and yet people get hit by cars all the time. People are robbed and murdered, and so there's this natural desire, I think, of humans to create a utopia where nothing bad will happen. But what ends up happening is usually a lot of bad things end up happening, just potentially not from the original way that we thought. I think it's really interesting what you're speaking about. And it was something also when we were going through the birthing process. This idea that also really resonated with me that I hadn't thought about, but as you were mentioning, that birth is a threshold for a woman, or I think what could also be said is an initiation. And I think that idea of initiation is very fundamental to a lot of traditional societies. For men, it could be, some very strong plant medicine ceremony, as you know, and you're very familiar. I work with tobacco, which you're familiar with as well, or plants like ayahuasca and toei, these very strong plants. And I think in Europe there was many of them too, probably a lot of the Solanaceae family of mandrake and henbane and these very strong plants. And always when working with those in that initiatory experience, that's why I think a lot of these shamanic practices have this idea of death embodied in them, because that death, I think often it gets spoken of now metaphorically, and there is a truth to that. But there was something real that was being spoken about too, is that you might actually die by doing this. And that's an initiation, is really pushing yourself to death, because, also as you were describing, when we're pushed to that point, very often something is awoken. Mm-hmm. And in these, I think so many traditional societies, that act of initiation was seen as something very vital of actually making a human being that had power, that had wisdom, that had insight. And as you said, and this may seem like a stretch to some people, but you also alluded to this, that ultimately someone that trusted in God, someone that trusted in the universe, someone who didn't put their faith in the world of man, but put their faith in something that's greater than that. But I think often we need those initiatory experiences to be able to find that strength, that power, that wisdom. And I think, like you were saying, that birthing process very much was an initiatory experience that most women had access to. And there is something that when we medicalize that, we take away that initiatory experience, because something is being done to us rather than us going through that experience. And so I think there is something very, very relevant in that way when you're speaking about that relational aspect to plant medicines. One of the things that I think is really interesting, and I also realize we're starting to get a bit short on time now. One of the things you've alluded to a number of times is this concept of God, and I think that's and this maybe ties into a bigger picture, because maybe this is many questions in one, so I'm just trying to get it out in a fluid way. But kind of tying back to the beginning, there's this idea when we mention this idea of roles and roles that we have in life, and I think for obviously with this idea of things start in a good way. As you said, even coming from a place of Poland where there was a lot of ancestral trauma and life could have been very tough. And people didn't have maybe opportunities, and perhaps women didn't have opportunities. And so these movements come, something like feminism, to try and bring women to a place where they do have opportunity. But at the same time, like we're talking about, all of these things, there's this pendulum effect. And if something swings too far in the other direction, then we can also get away from something. And I think it's something that especially a lot of women actually struggle with now when they don't have a child, or they've lost that idea of what it is to be a woman, to have a role, in the same way that as in many societies we come from with these ideas of religion or Christianity, there was a traumatic response that many people experienced from that. And so they moved away from that to an idea of a world with no God, a world where all power is in the realm of man, which is very antithetical to traditional societies around the world. I mean, traditional societies had a very, very concrete and solid idea of God as a creator. Can you maybe talk a bit more about what kind of that spiritual evolution has been like for you in the realm of the birthing process, in the realm of religion, and even with plant medicines? I mean, when you started this conversation, to some people that may not sound strange, but I think to many people, that idea that under the influence of a plant or a plant brew like ayahuasca, you were able to see something that hadn't been manifested yet. That's not something that's in our, and I mean the worldviews, the cosmovisions that we come from. That doesn't make sense. That defies time. It defies possibilities. What is when? Again, this is a huge question, and I'm sure there's many ways you can take this. But what is that evolution, that role of spirituality, of God, been for you? Because it's that specific word, even of God, is something you've used many times, and it's not something that most people use when they speak. Like it's not. Maybe strangely, but it's not something that people tend to use in their common vernacular anymore.
Mm. Yeah. Oh, I mean, do we have 6 hours to talk about God? Yeah. God is beyond time, God is beyond space, and God is beyond all of our concepts of self, which is why I think it weaves so beautifully with what you were sharing about initiation. We now find ourselves in this I'm talking about the modern Western society, sterile world that is terrified of nature. Every sneeze, you need to get a jab. Every sickness, there is a pandemic. And somewhere along the way, as the things that we normally would have moved through as rites of passage became institutionalized and monetized and systematized, we lost our connection to nature. Therefore, we also lost our connection to God. Because I do believe that if we are living with God, no matter what is unfolding within our lives, we are able to receive it with trust. We are able to see it as, okay, well, this is part of my path now. And what is love teaching me right now? What am I asked to do? What am I asked to show up for? Why could this be happening? I think in a relationship with God, for me at least, there is no fear. Because I trust implicitly that my life is unfolding exactly as it's meant to, and placing my burdens, my worries, my troubles in God's hands, I feel fully provided for. If I feel fully provided for, then I am less likely to give my power away to a system that is promising me safety. However, we find ourselves in this bubble, sterile world where safety is being promised by many different structures. And somewhere along the way, that clarity of a conversation with God is lost. Because yes, of course, how can we tell that we will have 2 children in about 5 years? But I do believe that in connection with God, God communicates, and I regularly have experiences where I am shown something. I am told what to do. I am told what to create. I am shown a path. I am being asked how to show up, and things manifest from this very intimate internal dialogue that I believe is between me and totality. I grew up in Catholic Poland, and when I was growing up, I don't know how it is now, but we had compulsory religion classes at school that were led by nuns and were just the driest, most depressing experience of memorizing prayers and, being told what to believe about everything. And when I was about 12 or 13, I asked my parents to sign me out. And I was the only one of 2 children out of an entire huge school of few hundred that no longer attended the compulsory religion classes. It was me and a boy who was from another faith, from like at least 500 kids. It was a huge deal not to go, and all respect to my parents for listening to my kind of feeling of sovereignty and my spirituality. But even and already then, it didn't make sense to me that there is supposed to be a middleman between me and God, that I am supposed to first tell this man here all the things that I've done wrong before he allows me to commune with God or to commune with Christ. And I did exactly what you named. I stepped as far away from Christianity as I could. I immersed myself in every single philosophy and path as far away from my place of origin as I could. I ended up living in India, studying in India, going really deep into the studies of non-duality, of Advaita Vedanta, and really devoting my life to the understanding of the totality and self through the Vedic lens. It really deeply resonated. It brought a lot of wisdom into my life. But as soon as I drank the first ever cup of ayahuasca, the first thing I saw was Jesus Christ. My first ever ceremony. And it was actually very funny because it was Jesus, then it was Shiva, and then it was Buddha, and then it was nothing. It was light of the most pristine, unconditional love that I've ever experienced, to the point that I spent hours just crying from the ecstasy of remembrance that I am so loved by God. And for me, the plant medicines have actually been like an intermediary between me and Christianity. The deeper I have gone into my own study of plant medicine healing traditions, the more dietas I did, the more ongoing was my communion with Christ, with Mother Mary, with Mary Magdalene, the more the scripture kept coming to me, the more the words of the scripture were making sense. And so for many years, my communion with Christ was something very ethereal, let's call it, very much a part of the ceremony, really feeling and experiencing Christ as a consciousness, as a frequency permeating my being that is there, that is reminding me to remember that I too am a child of God, that I too am capable of forgiving, that I too am capable of living one with all of creation from this beautiful love that he embodied. But it only really started to take a different shape, I guess, a few years ago, when suddenly it clicked for me that we are talking about an actual human being who lived on planet Earth not too long ago. 2,000 years is nothing in the scale of how long we've been here. And I remembered from childhood being in churches in Poland and seeing all these statues and seeing, the Christ on the cross and everybody beating their chest, and, oh, it's my fault, and this very Catholic shaming prayer. And here in Peru, I find the statues in churches can be very morbid. Perhaps it's a reflection of the already very morbid history of this land, that people have to really see the blood and the suffering to feel it, because they themselves have gone through so much historically. So when you go to a Christian church here, the statues are massive and they're just dripping with blood and they have wounds everywhere. It's very, very strongly presented. And one day, my daughter really likes going into churches and sitting and looking and listening to church music. So one day we were in church in Cusco and we happened to sit under a statue of Jesus, and I just looked. And it sounds so strange to say I got it, because what is there really to get? But I got it. I saw the human who came to teach us about our relationship to God. And in that moment, for whatever reason, everything I've been studying from all the different paths, from all the different traditions, it clicked for me. And for me personally, it brought me right back into the heart of Christianity as I believe it was always intended to be. The very intimate, direct, sovereign relationship to God. And I can say with, full ownership, I am devoted to Christ and I am living by Christian values in a very different way than they were presented to me as a child growing up in post-communism Catholic Poland. I see that as an invitation into unconditional love, into a full ownership of my life, and a beautiful foundation for my children to be growing up with, anchored in that faith. And, I want to tie this back to the birth because I think it is so beautifully mirroring each other. Like the movement in birth mirrors the larger movement in the world. And this call for more and more women to be sovereign in their experience of bringing life earthside, the more and more women returning to birth as a ceremony, birth as a threshold, I think there is a collective movement from organized religion towards an intimate, direct relationship with God. For centuries, organized religion priests positioned themselves as gatekeepers of God. This started as soon as Christ died, really, and even then, when he was teaching, he was actually teaching to expose, to shine the light on the so-called self-proclaimed gatekeepers. The truth has flowed through institutions. Authority lived in hierarchy, and for centuries, we had to have this middleman to allow us to commune with God. There was obedience, there was, access to God requiring these priests that often were actually monetized and benefiting financially from holding those roles, and anything that was deviating from that relationship was framed as danger. Medicine developed in exactly the same structures. Hospitals have been and still are perceived as gatekeepers of health and safety. Doctors are the middlemen between us and healthy bodies. And intuition, direct connection is replaced by compliance and protocols. So in both systems, in religion and in the medical world, our inner agency is replaced with external authority. And so I think what we are talking about and what we're witnessing in the world now, in both birth and faith, is not rebellion, but reclamation, a very real reclamation of humans seeking sovereignty, not by rejecting the care or by rejecting the love, but rejecting domination that's been imposed on us by systems without any kind of consent. I think people leaving organized religion are not rejecting God. They are rejecting control without actual relationship. So this movement, individually and collectively for us, probably is about moving from imposed hierarchy to relationship, moving from institution to real embodiment, from obedience to discernment, from middleman to direct connection and relationship, from fear to trust. Again, I don't think we can have fear when we trust deeply. I think there are two sides of one coin. It's either or. And then I think we're moving from control to sovereignty. And within this, I see that something much deeper is happening. And I'm curious if you notice this too, because I have, and many people in my community are speaking about it across cultures and countries. Right now, there seems to be this real widespread reawakening to Christ. Suddenly, many people are speaking about Jesus, and speaking about Jesus not as a religion, not as a doctrine, not as an institution. Many of us grew up like that. But a lot of people seem to be awakening to Jesus as a presence, as truth, as love, as remembrance, and as what I'm touching on quite a lot, as a sovereignty in our relationship to God, which I believe is, how Christianity was always intended. I believe that's what Jesus came to teach us. And I don't think it's coincidental. I named it moving through the collective birthing canal, but what we are witnessing is that global systems are destabilizing. They're destabilizing politically, economically, socially, even medically. And all these illusions that we build around ourselves of this safe planet Earth where everything is under control and nobody will ever die and we are healthy and pretty and whatever, all of this is coming undone. Illusion of safety and authority is completely dissolving and institutions are losing credibility. All over the world, institutions are losing credibility and narratives are fracturing. And all the structures of control we've been wrapped in, they're really in our face right now. They're becoming visible, I think, to more and more people. And in that unraveling, individually, collectively, I think many of us are returning to the one who taught us who we truly are. And I don't see Jesus as hierarchy. I don't see Jesus as a gatekeeper. I don't see Jesus as a shame, fear-based salvation theory that's drowning into our unworthiness, as it was presented to me as a child. I see Christ as a reminder of inner authority, as a sovereignty, as my direct relationship with God, as is my birthright, and as a truth beyond any systems. I really see that Christ is the kingdom within. It is an experience of remembrance of divinity embodied. It's a remembering. And I am witnessing that many of us, individually, collectively, are going through this remembering right now at this moment in time. And for me, with my story and with where I come from, what I grew up with, it isn't just philosophical or, this kind of theory of what Christ is to me. It's a very personal experience. When I was birthing Micah, our son, I had a direct encounter with Christ in a way I've never had in plant medicine. I met him many times with plants, but this was so different. As my birth was moving into this very psychedelic, non-dual state of consciousness, something became very, very clear to me. I understood fully in my bones, in this space beyond any thought I could form, because I was fully dissolved into just merging with God, that this is intentionally kept at distance from us. This is intentionally kept as an experience of disempowering disconnection through separation from the body, through all the imposed intervention and fear and talk about, we have to do this to you, etc. We are literally being severed from our bodies, our intuition, inner knowing, sovereignty. Because in that state, while birthing my son, I was completely one with the totality. I was one with God. I was inside of God and God was inside of me. And that was all that there was. It was a crystalline, clear remembering of my true nature. And in that space of merging with God while birthing my son and bringing him earthside, I had this really vivid clarity that if every single woman truly knew how close we are to God, not conceptually, we can all know that conceptually, but somatically, if every single woman had this non-dual, ecstatic, God love experience while birthing their babies through embodiment, most of systems of control would simply lose their power. Not through rebellion or destruction, but through irrelevance. They would be irrelevant in the face of God. Because when a woman is in her power, in her agency, in her sovereignty, in her embodied presence, she is already in a direct relationship with God. Birth, when held in agency and presence, is a direct line to the divine. Not only the path, but an embodied experience. And this isn't about it being superior or better or right and wrong. It is simply a very visceral and open to us all and available to us all reminder of our closeness to God. It is already there. God is not separate from us. But I think it's a very inconvenient remembrance for those who are trying to hold up the hierarchy of power and structures of right and wrong and victim and perpetrator, and you need me to live life. You need me to be safe. You need me to know God. We don't need intermediaries to access the divine, just like we do not need intermediaries to be healthy. And we don't need permission from anybody to remember who we are. Our bodies are not separate from God. They are one of the places in which God is known. And so the real story isn't birth was deadly and the doctors fixed it. It also isn't medicine is the enemy or institutions are evil. The real story is birth has always carried risk. Systems determine how risk is responded to. Faith has always existed. Systems determine how faith is being mediated. God has always been present. God is always present. Systems determine how accessible we believe God is. And the human story, I think, again and again is the same, that we forget. We forget, so we outsource. we forget and we outsource, so we experience ourselves as separate. When we experience ourselves as separate, we organize and we institutionalize and we control or seek for someone to control, give the power away. And then eventually, I think a moment comes across all of the systems that we remember. And this is where plants are such amazing allies, because I do believe they nudge us exactly into that. We remember, we return, we are shown all the places in which we are not free. And so then we get the choice. We can choose, we don't have to, but perhaps we get to choose to reclaim, to decentralize, to embody, to reconnect. And again, I'm not talking about rebellion or reaction or a trend. I'm talking about very real, very simple, very naked, intimate remembrance, returning, reclamation of truth, sovereignty awakening. And as sovereignty awakening, we are rediscovering the Christ within. God remembered, life re-entering into the body. And in that lens, divinity is no longer outsourced, because we don't have to go to the temples. We don't have to bow to people sitting on thrones. We don't have to bow to institutions or systems. The heart and the consciousness are the only authority. And if we can fully be embodying that wise, pulsating love that is there, then God is in everything we interact with. Therefore, how could we be scared of anything? How could we believe that someone else can offer us something good that God cannot? It is so perfectly designed. And in this process of forget, the invitation is always to remember. And what I'm witnessing in the collective and individual return to Christ, and what I'm witnessing in women choosing to have a sovereign birth experience, is exactly that. The courage to say, you know what? It just doesn't feel good for me anymore. Let me try something different. Let me try what it would be like to believe myself as already so deeply loved by God. What would life be like then if I knew that I am already safe and provided for? And I think that's where miracles begin to happen.
Well, Marta, I don't think that could be better put. Very, very beautifully put. I know. I think we've come up on our time where, as a mother, you're now being called. But
Back to duty.
And I think your growth, your wisdom. I mean, the way you're able to convey that message is very, very apparent. So. I think all the listeners will get a tremendous amount out of this. And, you're very much speaking from a very lived place, which I think is always the essence of wisdom is that lived experience. And, we've spoken a little bit about this. I think not in super depth, but I know often speaking about these things, about birthing and the roles of women, the medicalization of birth, and this unraveling of institutions, not necessarily putting our faith in institutions and the power of reclaiming sovereignty, and really of questioning these institutions. I mean, it's not always easy in the sense that it's touching on a deep fear, a deep lack of power that many people experience, and it's there can often be a felt sense of the kind of backlash from that. So I commend you for your courage of doing that, because it that idea of speaking truth and having wisdom, it's not easy. I mean, one, to arrive to that, and then two, to have the courage to speak. And I think that's what having a deep faith actually begins to bring us, is that courage to actually speak, because it's truth, and we don't. We can't hide from that, and to really share that. So I think you're doing that beautifully. So thank you so much for this beautiful interview. I think we could easily talk for another 2 hours. I think we just we just touched on the surface of a lot of these topics. If people are interested in I don't know, working with you or reaching out to you or learning from you, what is the best way that people can do that?
So in most seasons, I have a very active online presence, but right now I've chosen to intentionally step out of visibility for a while and focus on some important reshufflings and shifts behind the scenes. I imagine I shall be back next year. I love being plugged into the online global community, and I typically have quite a lot to share there. However, while I'm taking this conscious, intentional pause from public platforms, I am continuing to work. It is just more privately, quietly, in a more intimate way. So right now, I am not planning on hosting any retreats in the near future. However, I am welcoming a small number of one-on-one mentorship clients who may be aligned with my work and who may be ready to step into the spaces that I offer in that intimate way of working together. So if anybody feels called to connect, to reach out, the best way right now is through email, which is info@Marta, without an H, Marta, Wanderlust.com. So yeah, anybody is interested in reaching out, I'll be super happy to hear from them. And I just want to close by saying, and I hope this was clear in everything I was saying, but just a disclaimer, I am obviously not telling anyone what to do or that one path has a higher hierarchy than other or is somehow more worthy. I think every woman can make choices for herself, and part of becoming disenchanted with systems, both medical and faith-based, etc., is forging our own path based in what feels true and appropriate for us. And I don't think anybody can tell anyone you need to have this birth experience, or you should be a follower of Christ. I think we arrive at our own awakening through our own pain. And yeah, if the sovereign birth is a path for a woman, I will be so delighted for her, and I will be supportive of her just the same way as I would be supportive of a friend who says, I want to go to the hospital and have epidural because I don't want to hear and feel anything. There is a lot of deconditioning that we have to do together as a global human community. And I think the biggest gift we can offer each other is the grace of not judging our individual states of awareness, but practicing the very beautiful loving kindness, and be okay with the fact that someone is just simply on a different page of the book. So I am not recommending anything to anybody, and I am not a medical professional. Thank you.
I'm glad you gave that disclaimer. That way I won't have to do that. So thank you very much, Marta. This was beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you again for sharing, and I look forward to connecting more, and hopefully in person one of these days in the not too distant future.
Who knows where? Thank you.
All right, everyone, that's it. I hope you enjoyed that conversation. It was really a pleasure for me to sit down and catch up with Marta. As I mentioned, I think it was a very profound conversation, really her sharing a very profound message from the depths of her lived experience and wisdom. So I trust you all gained a lot from that. If you're interested in working with myself, my colleague Marav Artsy, doing plant medicine retreats, you can check out my website at nicotianarustica.org. Also, if you're interested in working one-on-one with me remotely, all of that is on my website, so you can find that there. And as always, if you're able to support this podcast, that's a really big help. It really relies and is supported by the viewers. So if you're able to financially support, that's a huge help. Patreon is, I'd say, the best option. You can sign up for as little as $1 a month. There's different tiers you can sign up for. Those tiers also give you different things back, things like early access to shows, bonus material, Q&As. As always, thank you so much to the people supporting that way. It means a lot. And if you're able to do that, thank you in advance. And then, as always, just helping with the algorithms is a really big help. So if you're viewing this on YouTube, hitting the subscribe button, turning on the notification bell, liking the video, and if you're listening to this on Apple Podcast or Spotify, leaving a starred rating and also a short review is super helpful in hopefully getting this show out to a bigger audience. So thank you all for tuning in. I hope this finds you all well, and I will see you all on the next episode.